Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you all here on an unusual Wednesday afternoon lecture for the Médiévale Institute. It's a great delight to have you come, and I wanted to say a little bit about this particular lecture. This is one of the lectures that we see as part of our Alumni Lecture Series. We try every year to bring back at least one former PhD student and now former postdocs to lecture students and postdocs who've gone off and made a great career of it in the academic world, and we want to bring them back and sort of show them off to everyone. And to introduce our speaker tonight, I want to bring forward my colleague Andrea Robiglio.
Thank you very much. Andrea has asked me to be brief, so I'll try to be brief, but it's very difficult with Andrea. So I'm very pleased to invite or to introduce Andrea Robiglio to all of you, but I'm sure many of you already know him. Andrea is a fixture in the philosophical fields for medieval studies and the Renaissance as well. His appointment is, if I'm not mistaken, in both medieval and Renaissance philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven. I will say one quick word about his publications, although he's asked me not to, just because I want to emphasize how much of a polyglot he is. If you go to his website on the Catholic University of Leuven and you look at the key publications, you'll find that the key publications are in Italian, a book from 2002, L'impossibile volere, Tommaso d'Aquino, I tomisti e la volontà, an article in French in the Revue Thomiste, an article in Dutch in the Tijdschrift voor Philosophie, which my Dutch is probably horrible here, and of course publications in English and also in German, Wenn ein Wiesermeister ein Heiliger wird. And so today Andrea is going to be speaking to us on the introduction to Romance philosophy, on the benefit to medieval studies and the study of their philosophy.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to come back 15 years after my time. And I also appreciate not only the invitation of the director, Professor Burman, but also his philological creativity, I would call it, because to invite me for an alumni lecture implies to stretch the notion of alumnus quite a bit, because I have been here indeed for 4 months on a scholarship. However, if we look to the etymology of alumnus, nutritius quem magister aluit, yes, I owe a big debt to this institute. Here not only was my first contact with the American academic world, but here I met colleagues and friends who have remained since in contact with me, and is also now we have a joint exchange agreement between my research unit and the Médiévale Institute, between Leuven and Notre. I hope that some of you will take advantage at some point of this agreement. And also a journal on which both the director of the Médiévale Institute and the kind colleague who introduced me sit from its very beginning, Mediterranea. So you have received a little handout, and it will be an impromptu speech. I will try to introduce this notion, but let me add a first apology. You have already noticed it, but let me stress that you will have to be very patient and tolerate my macaronic accent. My time in Belgium, despite occasional teaching in English, didn't help to improve my English, which remained quite heavily loaded by my Italian pronunciation. I hope you will be able to understand nonetheless what I'm going to say. The title hopefully sounds ambiguous. Introduction to Romance Philosophy, on the benefit to medieval studies of the study of their philosophy, where there is referred to medieval studies, and which already implies that there is philosophy is at the singular, but is predicated of different kind of medieval studies. What I want to do today is, on the one side, very simple and basic. On the other, it may be ambitious if I wouldn't have such a trust in the understanding and of my audience. Why introducing this terminology, Romance philosophy? In the book The Spirit of Romance, published in 1910, Ezra Pound opened with the following statement: literary criticism is the vain attempt to find a struggle, to find a terminology to define something new. And I think that the struggle to find a terminology, which can be, of course, revised and changed, is not just an effort to find a title that sounds attractive, more or less, but is an effort to help those who look at this syntagm, to help them to displace their view, to take a different angle to text material that are certainly known. I can anticipate that the four authors I'm going to deal with briefly today are classics of the medieval studies. Petrus Alfonsi, Disciplina Clericalis, Thomas Aquinas, here we have, is just there, not too far from where I'm speaking. And Marguerite Porete, I went here to the bookshop and I saw that it's used in some of the courses, is in the textbook, so this is certainly a popular text also here. And Dante. Notre Dame is today arguably the most important center for Dante studies in the world, and is, by the way, intimidating to speak of Dante here at the presence of those scholars. By the way, he's the last of the authors, so if I get too long on the other three, probably I will be able to say, oh sorry, I have no more time for that. So what is these, you find on the handout a bibliography. I will occasionally refer to some of those texts, but why Romance philosophy? Of course, someone could think of a mistake. I wanted to say Romance philology, and it turned out that the automatic corrector put philosophy. But indeed, no, it was intentional. And it is indeed inspired by a certain tradition in Romance philology. And to introduce that, let me quote a text which I consider very engaging and interesting. It's one of the last texts he wrote, Edward Said, in the 25th anniversary edition of his successful book, Orientalism. He wrote for the occasion a new preface. And one passage, the preface is very interesting from the beginning to the end, but I sorted out just one passage, which concern the sort of ideal library, the masters, those authors that were for him the guides in this research that ended up with the publication of Orientalism. As a humanist whose field is literature, you have this on your handout, I am old enough to have been trained 40 years ago in the field of comparative literature, whose leading ideas go back to Germany in the late 18th and 19th centuries. I must mention too the supremely creative contribution of Giambattista Vico, the Neapolitan philosopher and philologist, whose ideas anticipate those of German thinkers such as Herder and Wolff. Later, to be followed by Goethe, Humboldt, Dilthey, Nietzsche, Gadamer. And finally, the great 20th century Romance philologists Erich Auerbach, Leo Spitzer, and Ernst Robert Curtius. There is clear, is not only a chronological order, there is also a sort of crescendo in relevance for Said's own research. The last three names are put at the end, but are the first as inspirational figure for Said. Auerbach, Spitzer, and Curtius, especially if you think of Auerbach and Curtius, they are the representative of a kind of a discipline in medieval studies, which they called Romance philology, Romanische Philologie, which, as they interpret it, doesn't exist anymore in Germany, is basically disappearing from all European universities. And I do not know, but I would venture to say that it's not very popular in the US either. There are philologists, but philologists who capitalize, think of Auerbach use of Simmel and of many philosophers we read. Auerbach was absolutely competent in philosophy, and the same for Curtius. And those are also the authors that still today remain in all the bibliography, for instance, in Dante studies. Why they remain so long? Why we go back to quote those authors? Because what they said, but most importantly, the way in which they said, has a vitality, has a sort of virtuality as well in it, which in a way remain a source of inspiration. So, in this list, there are more philosophers than philologists, but this list putting together under the shadow of Vico both disciplines is a first motivation for me to choose this syntagma, Romance philosophy. And the syntagma want to indicate a pattern which doesn't aim to substitute other patterns that already exist, like scholastic philosophy, monastic philosophy, vernacular theology, philosophy for laymen. I'm cheating labels for which of those labels is possible to list a specific bibliography that has been constituted in the second half of the 20th century. So, Romance philosophy want to be a further paradigm, a further pattern, which doesn't want to compete in the way to substitute other, but just offer another perspective, another angles. You may be familiar with this, is a famous optical illusion, which after a British cartoonist was called My Wife and My Mother-in-Law. You have the figure of that depicts both an old woman and a young lady. Well, an old woman looking off on the left with a big nose, and a young lady facing away looking over her right shoulder, and the old woman nose is in the chin of the young woman. What is typical of this illusion is that you can see either one picture or the other. You cannot see both at the same time. You have to switch from one to another, but you cannot see both at the same time. And it is enough to change a little detail in the nose, in the fourrure, and the illusion doesn't work anymore. And this is a sort of symbol to introduce my topic. So it is important to have a detailed approach to the text, because the detail can help us to recognize a pattern or make us unable to see it. Which are, before entering the four case studies briefly, let me introduce which are common features of what I call Romance philosophy. Well, the dominance of both the subjective and the anthropological viewpoints, where the human science, medicine, physiognomy, moral psychology, if you allow me anachronistic terminology, aesthetics, take center stage. Reflection on language, a self-aware use of it, which is not obvious in the other tradition I mentioned, or not always optional, and which imply the pervasive recourse to rhetorical narrative strategy to support the argumentation. An encyclopedic ambition, however, a sectorial encyclopedia, a sort of sectorial retrievals, deeping issues as divine election, recognition, the centrality of ethics with the focus on notions like nobility and purgatio, the question of testimony and its pivotal role both in epistemology and in moral psychology. The relevance of the category of play, which introduce curious intermittences in the sphere of morality. And again, the guiding role of storytelling and its ironic registers, parody, etc. The way of life or the manner of living posited as condition for the search for truth, while the latter is experienced as an adventure of self-recognition, chivalric cat, soteriological journey. The theme of journey, extremely important in this area, in this paradigm. The connection with the literary genre of the novel, the constant use of polar opposition, more than just the reference to the empire of dialectics. Some even more distinctive feature, the inevitable feminine mediation and the role of the woman. This is true of all the authors, for instance, that I presented, even the case of Aquinas that seems the one who less fit this, but if you read carefully, fits very well. Humor and the omnipresence of humor, the subjective experiential perspective, and which is already a bit implicit with what I have said, the authorial reflexivity, or if you prefer, a sort of basso continuo of the thinker's autobiography. Here again, Aquinas of the four seems the one who fits less, and in this case, he fits less than the other three. However, what I wanted to indicate here is a sort of features that has to be present together, but with gradients, so to speak, of intensity, which can be variable. It's a sort of orientation. It's not a definition. It's a sort of empirical way to address this notion. So let's now start with, I will try to be short on each of them. Each of those authors are quite well known and do not need a particular introduction. And for each of the authors I'm going to talk about, in this room sits one or more scholar who know better than me. So I'm speaking under correction. Petrus Alfonsi, the Disciplina Clericalis is a fascinating text. It's a collection of stories. However, if we look at the text, Petrus Alfonsi in the prologue, he clearly said that this text is written for exercitatio, which has also a pedagogical connotation, this term, in sancte philosophiae, one could think that philosophia can mean many things, and one of the excursuses of Curtius' great book on the European literature and Latin Middle Ages concern precisely the polysemy of the word philosophia in the Middle Ages. However, we should take seriously this claim and not just dismiss, well, he's not doing philosophy. He pretends that he's doing philosophy. And how does he define the book? I put here the quotation already taken from the prologue. He said, propterea, you have the translation on the handout, propterea ergo libellum compegi partim ex proverbis philosophorum, et suis castigationibus. Partim ex proverbis et castigationibus arabicis et fabulis et versibus. Partim es animalium et volucrum similitudinibus. And immediately after he adds, modum tamen consideravi, nesi plus necessaria scripserim, scripta oneri potius int lectori quam subsidia. This stress of the importance of brevity and good measure. Modus is one of the ways in which in the Latin text of, let me now take seriously my own label, of Romance philosophy, modus very often translate mesura, the mesura of the troubadours, which is very difficult to define. Paolo Cherchi devoted an entire chapter of his book on Andrea Capellanos to try to define what is this mesura. However, is not a trivial term. So if he says that modum tamen consideravi, I also took into account the right measure, is something extremely important. Maybe not to say what does it mean in detail, but it's not a trivial remark. And later he invites to a sort of slow reading. He says you could read and be a bit shocked by what you find. You can think that I'm saying something on the edge of heresy, etc. Well, in this case, I invite you to read and read again. This is also very interesting. Subtiliori oculo iterum et iterum relegere moneo. So I beg you, read and read it again with more subtle eyes. This is a clear, let's say, spy that this text has sort of levels of readings that one could has to take into account. The text shows the familiarity with a lot of sources. This scholarship has already shown. Also the familiarity with the rhetorical tradition. In the Rhetorica de Regnum, for instance, we have an opening concerning three key terms: fabula, historia, and argumentum. The historia is probably the content which is taught, is what is the narratio aperta, what is said, what is the content, for instance, in this story, the moral teaching that one of this story contains, and this is given ad docendum in order to teach. But there is also an element of verisimilitude, of probability, which has more a protective function, ad movendum, and this is the argumentum. So, to improve the mores, to make people better by reading. And then there is the fabula, and the fabula seems the one aspect which doesn't carry any truth value, because the fabula concern the delectatio, the pleasure of the text, the pleasure of reading, and is just connected with the ordo naturalis or artificialis of the text as it is written. Well, it is interesting that in many of the story, and I can just select one of them, which is is a story of a little bird. It's a story that starts after a discussion on what is the true nobility. So again, one of the characterizing topics. And is a dialogue between a little bird and a farmer. The farmer has captured the bird and keeps it in his hand. And the bird is worried because it can risk his life. And then he developed an argument, say, I'm very little, if you cook me, you really have not much. If you want me to sing, you have to let me free, because if you keep me so, I won't sing, so even the pleasure of my song will be lost. And especially I will tell you 3 very important advices if you let me free. It's not a sophisticated argument, but the farmer was not particularly sophisticated, probably. It's enough for him to let the bird free. And once the bird is free, you say, oh, stupid have you been. You don't know what you lost. In any case, I give you these 3 advices. First, don't believe what people tell you. Ne credas omnibus dictis. Second, only what is really yours will remain yours. What is not yours can always go away. And the third, don't be sad for what you have lost, because it is gone, and you have there is no point in being sad about it. If you had known there is a precious stone in me, if you had cooked me, you would have found the stone and you would become a rich man. Now I'm free and I stay very far from your hands. And the farmer is absolutely say, oh, what I did, I had the luck of my life in my hand, technically, and I let it go. And then he said, well, look what I said. Don't believe to what people say you. Who knows? I'm so light. Are you sure that there is a precious stone in me? And so on is a sort of deconstructive approach of the bird that reading this piece, you never know whether the bird is saying something true or not. However, at the end, there is a truth in the story, not in the content, not in the argumentum of what is said, even not in the historia, but the fabula presents a story. It is a sort of teaching which is given in the form, and is a teaching that concerns the fact that language is open to deception, and but there is a way in which you could use this deceptive nature of language to learn a lot about yourself, about the reality. You see, this is a kind of teaching which is certainly of philosophical relevance, can also be much more in detail analyzed, but is presented in an eccentric form, in a narrative form first, but also in a use of argument which is intentionally deplacing the role of the we now move to Aquinas, which at first it seems the author that in this story of the Romance philosophy fits not so well, because he's a schoolman, very severe. The early biography says that he never laughed. Even when his member of his family passed away, he never showed a moment of sadness or a tear. So he seems a very insensible, dry schoolman, all concentrated in his speculation. However, this is maybe also the way in which we have read in a monumentalized way Aquinas, because Aquinas is full of surprises if you look carefully. It is a topic that I will deal in another occasion in a conference that will take place in Louvain-la-Neuve, so I don't touch on that now. But the position of Aquinas is very innovative and radical concerning the problem of humor. Aquinas says explicitly that the condition of in the heaven, the beatific condition is a condition of people who laugh. Of course, it's a kind of laugh that you see, you don't hear. So it's a sort of smile rather than a heavy laugh. However, this goes directly against William of Auvergne and the standard position of the school. He argued via the proprium accident of Aristotle. But we are not dealing with the topic of humor, which would be interesting nonetheless. We are dealing with another aspect. Aquinas, as attested in the first sources, as a text, as an author read and appreciated by women. There was a niece of the Pope John XXII who apparently was fascinated, was expanded, Frigerio, who tells us in his biography, who was a reader of Aquinas. When I was here in 2006, and after my stay I published a little booklet concerning the canonization of Aquinas. I had the privilege to be able to work in the microfilm room, not far from here, in the Schoner archives. And Schoner not only worked on the list of the authentic writings of Aquinas and on the manuscript of Aquinas' work. The Schoner catalog is still today a reference. But he also started a research, which he unfortunately never completed, on the biographies. The biography of William of Tocco was then published by a disciple of his. And the tradition of the Miracula Sancti Tome. There are local, regional tradition in areas. One is, of course, Naples and around Naples. The other is around Rome. The other is around Pavia, in which there is this tradition of miracle, usually connected with an altarpiece in honor of Aquinas, and this tradition widespread precisely in the years immediately after the canonization, so 21, 22. And in one of those documents, which is in a manuscript, Roma Archivio of the Dominicans, Archivio Generale dei Frati Predicatori, 1423, the reference to this manuscript I owe to a list which I found in the Schoner archives. And then, so I owe to Schoner work if I was able to go and find this manuscript. There is an interesting, some of those miracles are very funny, and those miracles are a bit different from the usual miracles of the typical 13th century saints. They are not very spectacular, and they are focused either on a question related to teaching and learning. So someone doesn't remember something, pray Aquinas, immediately find the passage it was reading. Someone else, he has to defend himself in a court, he needs a quotation of Augustine to make his case in court, he cannot find, he goes to pray Aquinas, and then the book is open, he immediately finds the passage. And another set of miracles that are all connected to Aquinas as the doctor of the passion of love. Aquinas seems to be the saint which is more useful for younger ladies or youngsters to be helped in obtaining the attention of a partner. Let me focus on one case, which is the case of Philip in Canis, a nobleman of Pavia, who has, well, we don't know if he has an affair or not, but certainly he has a flirt with a lady, Ricca Donna de Pasturinis, daughter of a rich merchant, but not aristocrat herself. Because of the social difference, he ran away from her after this first flirt. However, he starts to have dreams, nightmares. Aquinas appears in his dream, and he's always saying, now you go and you marry her. Now you go, desponsa eam, desponsa eam. Really so obsessed by that he decides to go, he asked the hand of the lady to the mother, and he married her. And then he confessed, he said, vere credo quod aliquod maleficium fecisti me. There was certainly a spell on me that made it impossible for me to run away from your daughter. And the mother and the daughter said that non fuisse maleficia, sed beneficium sancti domen. So, this is not far-fetched. If we looked at the Summa, the most personal work of Aquinas, in the Summa we have something that no other parallel text has before. Let me use the word of Nicolas Lombardo in a nice book, The Logic of Desire, Aquinas on Emotion, published some 10 years ago. When Thomas Aquinas finished the Prima Secunde of the Summa Theologiae in 1271, question 2248 probably constituted the longest, most sustained discussion of the passions ever written. This is an elephant in the room. In a Summa of Theology, not in the section on virtues and vices, but before that section, to have this huge treatise on the passion. There is a system of 11 passion, 11 kinds of passion, all based on the passio amoris. And it seems that Aquinas is not particularly bold, because he limits to say the passion of love, as such, in itself, is neither good nor evil. It's not at all a neutral statement, because in a context in which, for instance, in the Sententiae of Peter Lombard, you had a statement like, the husband has to love his wife ratione, non affectu, with the head, not with his heart. Or again, sapiens judicio amat coniugem non affecto, omnis ardentior amator proprio uxoris adulter est. This was the scholastic tradition. Of course, there was the courtly literature beside. But in the scholastic tradition, the passion of love, as such, as passion, as not as a metaphor for a dilectatio, as you find in St. Bernard, etc., is consistently considered evil. More evil, less evil, but consistently evil. Now, to be neutral, when nobody is neutral, is not neutral. In other words, to keep a statement that say the passion of love in itself is neither good nor evil is extremely bold. And why Aquinas put this section on the passion in a Summa Theologiae? Why he has all this discussion on love? Why in one of the objections he even arguably implicitly quotes the incipit of the De Amor of Andrea Capellanus, which 6 years later will be the text explicitly condemned by Etienne Tempier in the 1277 condemnation. Well, probably because he was aware that there was another world of conceptualization of love was going on in the society, and it was very dangerous not to be able to have that integrated in a way in which theological categories and philosophical categories could also give an account of that kind of experience and the world. So this dimension is clearly a dimension that makes Aquinas not at all an example of conformity, but on the contrary, an example of lack of conformity with the main trend of the clerical scholastic literature. Can be connected even to his personal experience, to the war in Naples, the court of Friedrich II. We do not enter now in the detail, but this is a matter of fact, which, of course, immediately meets the eye. Let's now move to Marguerite Porete. As I said, there won't be time for that. Marguerite Porete writes a marvelous text. On Saturday, Professor Robbins was there. There was this meeting to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first publication of the Heresy of the Free Spirit by Robert Lerner in Chicago. And once more was stressed how this text is a literary masterpiece. Is also a text philosophically very dense. And I would like to focus on one passage which, once again, has to do with love. You find it on the handout. First, in the chapter 52, which is an important chapter because there is, using the term in Latin, Margarita, which means pearl, but is also the name of Margarita. So there is a clear, let's say, self-reference in that, is love who is speaking, or very high-born, optime nata, says love to this precious pearl, Margherita. It is well that you have entered the only noble manor, where no one enters if he is not in our lineage and without bastardy. The soul, says love, has entered into the abundances of flowings of divine love, not, says love, by the attainment of divine understanding, for it could not be any intellect, whoever enlightened, could attain any of the flowing of divine love. And this topic comes later again, in which the optime natus is the one who belongs to this noble lineage, to a royal folk, those who have arts excellently noble, of great enterprise. This is a nobility which allows the touch, the grasp of truth, however, in a way that is defined against the ambition of reaching this truth by the means of the use of human reason and the intellect. It's clearly said here. It's a sort of attainment which is done beyond and the human intellect notwithstanding. Well, this expression I'm using here for a matter of expediency, also because I have not much time. The Latin translation, which was not by Marguerite herself, but was still a text that circulated and was approved by no less than people like Gottfried Fontaine. So it was a text of a vernacular culture that circulated in the scholastic milieu. Well, for those authors, the term optime natus, which as such you find also in Cicero, etc., has also a technical meaning. And it is interesting to notice that Marguerite seems quite aware of this philosophical, scholastic meaning of the word, even though she deconstructed and she opposes a new reading. The scholastic meaning of bene natus, which in Boïthius' translation of Aristotle translates the Greek euphues, man of natural ability, of ingenuity, someone who has a talent, understand, I don't know if someone, a smarty, someone very bright, who is very bright also thanks to the well-balanced bodily complexion, the fact that his sensibility is refined, he has better data from the sensibility and can better think. And this is the bene natus. This meaning of bene natus, beside the trivial one of the people who is well born because he's born in a rich family, is a notion that implies the use of reason at a higher, more sophisticated level, thanks to this better complexion and to a sort of natural talent. Bene nati gaudent in bona proportione musice, says a text on the quadrivium. Those who can really enjoy music or play music are bene nati. Those who can use logic, bene eligere verum et fugere falsum, qui nati sunt bene, possunt bene facere. Well, you clearly see that the text of Margherita, with the optime natus, with the it clearly said this notion of bene natus is a human excellence based on the use of reason, and this indeed is no excellent at all, because cannot provide access to the conjunction with God. Rather, present a sort of resistant to this annihilation. And so here we have another author who writes a text which is not structured in a way of arguments, however, is very densely in conversation with this culture around her, not just in vernacular, and therefore the multilingualism of the Romance philosophy is an element to stress. It's not a vernacular against Latin, but is rather a multilinguistic approach in which Latin and vernacular languages, and sometimes also some other languages, we have seen with Petrus Alfonsi, are in constant transfer and circulation. So I don't know if these cases, of course the case which would have convinced you definitely would have been Dante. However, I have no more time to deal with him. There is some literature on the doubt you may refer. It may be better that I stop here and there is time maybe for some question and clarification if I have not been clear enough. Thank you very much for your patience.